George Lucas had some interesting thoughts about why corporate filmmaking absolutely sucked back in the 2015s. And I think you can directly apply the comments that he made to how Disney has handled Lucasfilm and the Star Wars property. I think you can also apply it to Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny as well. So, Star Wars creator George Lucas explained back in 2015 to Charlie Rose why Disney's ownership and control of Star Wars was going to be so terrible. He did an interview with Rose that was broadcast on December 25, 2015, but took place before the release of The Force Awakens. In the interview, he famously described the Walt Disney Company as white slavers, but maybe more importantly, he explained why Disney's control of Star Wars was doomed to fail, as longtime fans have witnessed since the Walt Disney Company acquired Lucasfilm and Star Wars back in 2012. You can watch the full interview here on BandingandComics.com. We got it. I'm not sure what channel this is. It looks Laurent Twee Tartor. You can find it on his channel, but it is here on BandingandComics.com. So let's get into this here. After Rose posited that the release of the original Star Wars was the moment that changed Hollywood, Lucas responded, well, it changed for the good and for the bad. And it's, again, when you invent things, well, you don't invent things. He's right. We don't invent things. We discover things, right? When you bring new things into a society, you can either, or as he says, bring them into society. Yeah. You can either, it's like the balance of the force. You can either use it for good or you can use it for evil. And what happens when there's something new, people have a tendency to overdo it. They abuse it. I think that's interesting words there, abusing it. I think Disney has done that to Star Wars. I don't think many people would disagree with that. Lucas went on to elaborate. Now, there were two things that got abused with Star Wars and still being abused. So they're still being abused, right? Disney. He's basically calling them out right there because Disney had Star Wars at that time. He says, one, when Star Wars came out, everybody said, oh, it's a silly movie. It's just a bunch of space battles and stuff. It's not real. There's nothing behind it. I said, well, there is stuff behind it. It's not just a space battle. There's more to it than that. It's much more complicated than that, but nobody would listen. Sounds familiar. Bob Iger, Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams didn't listen about what Lucas had to say when they were basically redoing A New Hope as The Force Awakens and putting just basically diverse characters in the roles of the original trilogy characters. And then killing off the original trilogy characters or completely degrading them. So he goes on and says, so they just said, well, it's simple. And we like the spaceships. We like the stuff. So they said, fine. So the spaceships and that part of the science fantasy, whatever, got terribly abused. And of course, everybody went out and made spaceship movies and they were all horrible and they all lost tons of money. So obviously, Force Awakens didn't lose tons of money. It made a bunch of money at the box office. It was like over $2 billion. But as we've seen, it didn't have it. It didn't. There wasn't anything else there. It was just basically a copy of the original Star Wars film, and we've seen decline after decline after decline at the box office. So much so that you had a backlash with The Last Jedi. It was so bad that Solo: A Star Wars Story actually lost Lucasfilm money at the box office, the first Star Wars movie to ever lose money at the box office. Nevertheless, Lucas goes on and says, and you say, well, there's more to it than that. You can't just go out and do spaceships. Yes, he's 100% right. And then he goes on and points to his second point. And he says, and the other part, which is the technology, which is, oh, we'll just take this new technology. It's great, especially when it came down later to digital technology where you can really do anything. And people just abused it all over the place, which they did with color, they did with sound. Whenever there's a new tool, everybody goes crazy and forget the fact that there's actually a story, and that's the point. You're telling a story using tools. You're not using tools to tell a story. And I think he's right there, too. He's pointing out that these are tools that you're supposed to be using to tell a story, and instead, we don't really get a story. We got a story that had already been told to us and was a derivative of it in The Force Awakens, and there wasn't anything really interesting about it. There was maybe a little bit of mystery with who Rey was, but it was the promise of a story that you were left. It wasn't the actual story. The Force Awakens was all about the promise of what was to come. It wasn't a satisfying single story. And that's a huge problem. I actually do think you can probably turn some of this criticism on himself when you look at the prequels and how he used the kind of green screen and blue screen technology with that. I do think that he did rely on that a lot, and I think some of the story probably did suffer. I think there's plenty of people out there that have very interesting criticisms of the prequels that are indeed valid. But he goes on and he makes a third point. He says, the other thing that got abused, naturally, in a capitalist society, especially in an American point of view, which is the studios and everything said, well, wow, we can make a lot of money. This is a license to kill, and they did it. And, of course, the only way you could really do that is not take chances. only do something that's proven. And this is something that we see a lot from the creatives, from a lot of these people that want to take chances, want to take risks. They're the story idea guys. They have things that they want to do, but you've got the suits kind of uh, putting leashes on them, putting collars on them. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes you need to have someone that does that. But other times you can be overbearing and it doesn't work out really well and it chokes out the product. But nevertheless, he goes on and says, We've to remember Star Wars came from nowhere. American Graffiti came from nowhere. There was nothing like it. Now, if you do anything that is not a sequel or not a TV series or doesn't look like one, they won't do it. They say, we want something new. That's the downside of Star Wars, and it really shows an enormous lack of imagination and fear of creativity on the part of an industry. I think that's probably still right to this day. I think you probably have some exceptions where Christopher Nolan might be taking some chances on things, Tenet, Inception, things like that, where you might have big filmmakers that are able to swing their weight around and get things made. But for the most part, it does indeed look like it's pretty much sequels, in-universe tie-ins, things like that, reboots, soft reboots, remakes, etc. And we're even seeing that on the video game side now too. It's not just movies, and the comics are doing it as well. Too. I mean, look what Warner Brothers is doing. They're going to do a Harry Potter TV show now, so just retelling the same story. He elaborated on this point, though. He says, "I mean, corporations are not known for, maybe not Silicon Valley. I actually think Silicon Valley now isn't very. They aren't willing to take a lot of risks anymore. The new iPhones, new phones are pretty much the same as the old phone, and then a lot of the risks that you did see, they ended up being complete fakes. There's like the woman with her like blood sampling stuff. So I think Silicon Valley is less risk averse now too. But nevertheless, he goes on. He says, but the old institutions, they're known for being risk averse, and movies are not risk averse. Every single movie is a risk, a big risk. Indeed, they are. He says the movie business is exactly like professional gambling, except you hire the gambler, usually some crazy kid with long hair who's like, I don't get this guy at all. You give him 100 million, and you say, go to the tables and come back with 500 million. That is a risk, he asserted. Now studios don't even think about it that way. They say, well, maybe if we told him that he couldn't bet on red, maybe if we told him, because we did market research and we realized that red wasn't. So they try to minimize their risk. But once you, and of course, you're hiring the kid to take risks, to be creative, to do things that have never been done before, that have never been tested, you have no idea whether they're going to work or not. That's completely the antithesis of what a big modern corporation is. They want to test things 360 ways. No, you just go out and do it, right? Well, that's what Yoda says, right? There is no try, only do. Specifically referring to corporate types running the studios, Lucas said, some of the worst thing that happens is when they think they know how to do it, then they start making decisions that ensure that it's not going to work. I think Matthew Vaughn was like talking about how they had like a whole other script for Halle Bailey or Halle Berry if she was going to come in and do the Storm X-Men: The Last Stand and reprise her role as Storm in that film, and then they decided they were going to like throw it in the trash or something like that. He made those comments at New York Comic Con, just absolutely crazy what these suits were going to do, like insulting her like that. Lucas would go on to criticize the market research done by major studios. He said over time, a lot of these issues that they were dimly aware of them have become institutionalized. Now they know that that movie will do well in France, the movie will do well in Denmark. This movie you can't do in Asia, and they've got their markets. They know how much of the share they get, and they do their little analysis, and then they say, we will or will not make the movie. I 100% agree with this. I think that's why you see some of the most stale corporate crap coming out of Lucasfilm right now. Just look at their most recent Ahsoka piece. Absolute garbage storytelling. There's nothing there. There's no heart. There's no soul. Again, it's the most interesting thing with Baylan Skoll, and it's the promise of a story. You don't actually get a story with him. There is no beginning, middle, and end. It's just a promise that you might get something from that. Really, really awful storytelling across the board. You can look at The Mandalorian Season 3. You can look, again, I think you can look, obviously, at The Last Jedi. You can look at the Rise of Skywalker, probably is even more an example of that. I think The Last Jedi, it was trying to do something, but it was just a complete anathema to what Star Wars is, whereas The Rise of Skywalker was just a complete corporate, like, Frankenstein creation. So Lucas goes on and says it has nothing to do with that, with what I do, which is make a movie something that people can enjoy. It has nothing to do with that. I made money in spite of myself, and I think I made money because I didn't care. I didn't care whether it was a hit or not a hit. I wanted to make this movie as a movie, And that's the thing they won't do. They can't do it. It's not in their constitution to do that. He then mimicked an imaginary corporate head saying, I have a fiduciary duty to come up with the thing. I got 10% a year, my stockholders. That's why I would never go public. And that's why I said I'm not going to be beholden to anybody. From there, he kind of segued into discussing selling Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Company and explaining one of the reasons he sold it was to look out for his employees because he wanted to make experimental films that likely would not make money. In fact, he says he wanted to make just basically personal films that he would share with his friends and family and potentially other filmmakers, share kind of like tips and things that he's kind of figured out as he's making those. And he said he wouldn't really actually show them to anyone. He just wanted to make movies. But I think that was a really good explanation of the state of Disney's Star Wars right now. And it came from George Lucas when he was assessing what was going on with the film industry at large back in 2015, just a couple years after he had sold Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Company and they were about to release The Force Awakens. I'm pretty sure he had already seen it. He knew what it was that they had created, and I'm pretty sure he was criticizing them specifically as well. So I just found it really interesting what he had to say here, and pretty much a lot of what he had to say has indeed come true. It just took some of us a little bit longer to see it as he saw it. So, but let me know what you think. What do you think of George Lucas's comments here, and how he kind of predicted what the state of Star Wars would be under the Walt Disney Company?
Subscribe for more.